The night was thick with heat and the smell of wet earth, the kind that sticks to your skin and lodges in your lungs. On June 14, 1841, Colonel Edmund Thornhill called his household to the drawing room of Thornhill Manor, and what he said next would echo across decades, though the world would never hear of it. His wife, Virginia, once the belle of Mobile, a woman whose mind gleamed like polished onyx but whose body now betrayed her with every breath, was to be placed under the care of a slave. Silas, a dwarf recently purchased for a sum that made whispers ripple across the auction block. It wasn't cruelty, at least not in the sense the household understood. It was an experiment, a secret so meticulously crafted that it had already claimed 7 lives before anyone knew her name. Thornhill and his circle of shadowed Southern aristocrats, members of what they called the Society of Medical Inquiry, had invested heavily, both financially and morally, in a pursuit hidden from polite society, the manipulation of life itself. They believed Silas' blood carried the key to Virgilia's salvation, a belief born from occulted science, feverish notes, and the arrogance of men who assumed dominion over human fate. The room fell silent. The servants, their skin pressed with sweat against the warm air, exchanged glances heavy with unease. None dared speak. Their fear was not only for Virgilia but for themselves. In Thornhill's eyes, there was the precision of a military mind and the curiosity of a predator. Every step he took, every word he pronounced, held the weight of inevitability, the knowledge that once this door closed, life as they knew it would fracture. Virginia sat in her reinforced chair, her bulk held steady by iron restraints hidden beneath layers of velvet and lace, her eyes flickering between anger, fear, and a curiosity only she could maintain. Her body had grown beyond what Alabama's suffocating summers could tolerate, but her mind remained sharp, devouring medical texts, desperate to grasp the invisible chains that held her. And now those chains were about to be tested in ways that no physician, no neighbor, no historian would dare record. Outside, the oak-lined drive groaned under the weight of the night wind, and the shadows of the manor stretched long and distorted across the red clay earth. Inside, history itself twisted. Thornhill's voice dropped lower, commanding, pulling the veil back on something the world had been forbidden to see. He spoke not to ask, but to decree. And in that moment, every man, woman, and child in the room understood. They were about to witness an experiment that would blur morality, power, and desire in ways that would haunt them forever. The first step into forbidden knowledge is always the hardest. And yet, none could turn away. Silas arrived at Thornhill Manor not as a man, not as a slave, but as a cipher, a living key to a puzzle no one outside that house could comprehend. At 3 feet 9 inches, he was diminutive, yet his presence carried the weight of something unnatural. Muscles rippled beneath skin too small to contain them, eyes dark, calculating, as if every motion in the room were already accounted for, measured and catalogued. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a silent testimony to a life hardened by violence. But it was the knowledge he carried that terrified those who glimpsed it. He was literate, versed in French and English, skilled in medicinal plants, and trained in other disciplines, whispered euphemistically at the auction, leaving a ripple of fear across the Southern elite. Colonel Thornhill observed silently as Silas was led to Virgilia. To him, she was no longer wife, no longer companion, but subject, a living experiment on the brink of revelation. His leather-bound journal, carried wherever he went, contained meticulous entries. Pulse readings, respiration, subtle changes in expression, the pattern of perspiration on her brow. Every observation, every calculation, was a step toward a hypothesis few could understand and fewer still would survive to witness. Behind the closed doors of Thornhill Manor, the Society of Medical Inquiry shadowed figures of wealth and influence watched from a distance, their fingers intertwined with money, ambition, and something darker. They had funded similar experiments before, all cloaked in the language of science, but with an undercurrent of sadistic curiosity. Men and women died quietly, their deaths attributed to fever, accident, or misfortune. No one outside the society ever suspected the truth, that the pursuit of life, of vitality, of the transference of essence, had a price measured in human bodies. The household staff, constrained by fear and duty, became unwilling witnesses. Esther, the head cook, watched her mistress struggle to maintain dignity as Silas approached. Celia, Virgilia's personal attendant, trembled as she guided the reinforced chair into position. Marcus and Isaiah, trained to obey without question, glanced nervously toward the closed basement doors where Thornhill conducted his late-night experiments, the faint clinking of metal a constant reminder of unseen horrors. And Virgilia, herself sharp-minded, desperate, could sense the shift in her own fate. She recognized the danger, the unspoken knowledge, the perverse fascination her husband held. Yet, trapped in a body that betrayed her, she could do nothing but endure, watch, and prepare. Her intellect became her weapon, a silent rebellion against the madness creeping into her home. This was no ordinary household drama. This was power exercised in the most intimate of spaces, the kind that bends morality, fractures trust, and forces every observer into complicity. And yet, the true horror had not yet begun. The days that followed were measured not in hours, but in the subtle war of control. Thornhill watched every interaction between Virgilia and Silas with the precision of a general studying enemy formations. He was fascinated by the tension, the unspoken communication that passed between them. Virgilia, trapped in her body, could sense an intelligence in Silas that unnerved even the colonel. He moved with purpose, a quiet command over the household, a strange authority born not from size but from something older, something instinctual. At first, the experiment was clinical: touch, observation, measurement. But the boundary between science and cruelty blurred almost immediately. Thornhill believed that the combination of Silas' blood, strength, and peculiar vitality could somehow restore Virgilia's failing body. He recorded minute details: the rhythm of her pulse when he instructed Silas to feed her, the way her skin warmed under his touch, the pattern of her breaths when she laughed or tried to laugh. Each data point was a step toward his ultimate goal, though neither she nor anyone else could foresee what it would cost. Silas, for his part, was no passive participant. His eyes, dark and calculating, carried a presence that unsettled the staff. He had been trained, taught, molded to obey but not blindly. There was a quiet defiance beneath his compliance, a recognition that the experiment was a game in which he held cards no one else had seen. The household whispered about him, about his other skills, about the quiet power in his diminutive frame. And yet, even in silence, he exerted influence. A look, a gesture, a deliberate pause, each became a weapon in a subtle battle for dominance. Virgilia's mind, sharp and desperate, recognized the layers of manipulation surrounding her. She understood the societal hierarchies, the colonel's obsession, and the larger web of the Society of Medical Inquiry that had orchestrated this nightmare. Knowledge was both her shield and her torment. She began to calculate, to anticipate, to push the boundaries of what Thornhill and Silas thought they controlled. Her resistance was quiet, invisible, yet potent, a dangerous awareness in a house designed to enforce obedience. The household, meanwhile, became the unwitting stage for moral disintegration. Esther, Celia, Marcus, Isaiah, Judith, and young Penny all watched, all participated in the unfolding drama, each carrying their own fears, guilt, and unspoken questions. None could leave. None could intervene. The walls of Thornhill Manor became a crucible, burning away civility, exposing raw desire, control, and the manipulation of life itself. And in the shadows, the society waited, eager to record results, eager to witness a transformation they believed would redefine the boundaries of medicine, power, and life. None foresaw that the true experiment was not the restoration of a body but the unearthing of something far darker, the fragility of human morality when faced with absolute control. By the third week, Thornhill's obsession had fully taken form. The manor, with its 23 rooms draped in ghostly white sheets, became a theater of silent dread. The basement, normally forbidden, now pulsed with a sinister rhythm, clanging metal, the hiss of steam, and the faint, unsettling scent of herbs and chemicals burned into the stone walls. Here, Thornhill conducted his private experiments, recording every minute reaction, every involuntary shiver, every faint flicker of life in Virgilia's failing body. Silas was no mere participant. He had become both instrument and catalyst, an enigma bound by the Colonel's design. The experiment itself defied conventional morality. Thornhill's notes describe transfusions and applications of unknown compounds, the careful mixing of Silas' blood with tinctures drawn from obscure medicinal texts, and a disturbing focus on what he termed the vital spark. He believed that Silas' unique physiology, a combination of dwarfism and extraordinary resilience, contained an essence that could restore Virgilia's failing body. He treated the process with surgical detachment, yet obsession dripped from every word, every gesture. He spoke of it like an architect speaking of a building that would reshape the world, but the foundation was human flesh. Silas, ever vigilant, seemed to understand the scope of the danger. He moved deliberately, watching both Thornhill and Virgilia, calculating, waiting. There was a subtle war beneath the experiment, power shifting quietly between them, a tension that the household staff felt but could not name. Virgilia, trapped in a body betraying her, began to manipulate the system in her own way, testing Silas' compliance, probing Thornhill's certainty, searching for cracks in the carefully constructed control. The first physical consequences were immediate and horrifying. Virgilia's skin reacted to the treatments in unpredictable ways: blotches, burns, sudden spasms of pain that left the household frozen in shock. Her breathing became erratic, her pulse a frantic drum against the meticulous charts Thornhill kept. Yet the Colonel remained unflinching, recording every detail as though witnessing the precise operation of a machine. To him, each crisis was not a signal to stop but a necessary step toward the ultimate revelation: the triumph of human will over the fragility of flesh. The staff whispered in the shadows, afraid to intervene, yet unable to look away. They became unwilling participants in a transgression that defied ethics, morality, and nature itself. Outside, the Alabama summer pressed against the manor walls, heavy and suffocating. But inside, the true heat was the fever of ambition, obsession, and the terrifying belief that life could be commanded by knowledge and cruelty. And still, none outside the manor would ever hear the truth. The experiment was not merely medical, it was a war over essence, over control, over the boundaries of what a man could impose on the living. By the fourth week, the house had already begun to fracture, and the first irreversible transformations were about to begin. By the fifth week, Thornhill's meticulous calculations had begun to manifest in ways that no one could have anticipated. Virgilia's body, once passive under the treatment, reacted violently. Spasms racked her limbs, her breathing became ragged, and a strange pallor overtook her once flushed skin. Yet there was something else, a subtle vitality, an almost imperceptible light flickering in her eyes that the Colonel interpreted as confirmation of success. To the household, it was horrifying to watch, a grotesque dance between life and decay, obedience and rebellion, pain and strange awakening. Silas, the dwarf slave whose very existence had been purchased for the success of this plan, began to exert influence in ways Thornhill could not control. Every step he took, every gesture was measured, deliberate. He seemed to understand the experiment better than the Colonel himself, reading Virgilia's reactions, anticipating the precise moments when the treatment would either fail or succeed. There were moments when his gaze held a weight of quiet judgment, and even Thornhill felt the unsettling notion that he was no longer entirely the master in his own house. The household staff began to fracture under the psychological pressure. Esther's hands trembled as she prepared the meals she could not eat. Celia's loyalty wavered as she saw her mistress suffer. Marcus and Isaiah whispered prayers in corners, and young Penny could not hide the terror in her wide, innocent eyes. Even Judith, the matriarch of the household, seemed haunted by the knowledge that whatever unfolded in the basement or the drawing room would leave a mark none of them could erase. They were witnesses to something that the world would never acknowledge, a secret designed to be buried in shadows. Thornhill, obsessed beyond reason, began speaking aloud in the empty halls, theorizing to himself, recording feverish notes on the nature of vitality, essence, and the transference of life. His voice, once commanding, now carried the tremor of a man both intoxicated and terrified by what he had unleashed. He believed he was approaching the pinnacle of understanding, but the truth was darker. The experiment was no longer just medical. It had become a contest of will, a confrontation between his desire to dominate life and the subtle autonomy of the two he sought to control. And then it happened. A shift, small and almost imperceptible at first. Virgilia's strength, though intermittent, began to rise in tandem with Silas' influence. The staff felt it in the room, a tension vibrating through the air. The house itself seemed to breathe, aware of the unspoken struggle between those who commanded and those who endured. In that moment, the lines between master, experimenter, and subject began to blur. Power, it seemed, was no longer where Thornhill believed it to be. At this point, the descent into forbidden knowledge begins to demand more than observation. It demands engagement. I want you to pause for a moment and write in the comments, "The spark has awakened," then write it again. Exactly the same. This locks in what you are about to see, seals your attention, and aligns you with the unfolding truth. The house of Thornhill Manor had become something unrecognizable. Shadows clung to the corners of rooms like living things, and the air pulsed with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something darker and unnameable tension that seemed to permeate every surface. Virgilia, once passive under the treatments, began to manifest the results of the experiment in ways no one could have foreseen. Her body, bloated and incapacitated, now exhibited sudden surges of movement, reflexes that should have been impossible, an energy that seemed to radiate outward and unsettle all who came near. The pulse of life, once controlled by Thornhill, was no longer his alone to command. Silas, the instrument of the colonel's obsession, had transformed from servant into a force no one could fully comprehend. Every glance he gave Virgilia, every touch, carried authority. He was no longer subordinate. The energy he wielded, his knowledge and subtle control, created a shift in the house's balance. The colonel, who had believed himself the orchestrator of life and death, began to feel the creeping terror of impotence. He barked orders, but the response came not out of obedience, but calculation, resistance, and, perhaps, something approaching mastery. The staff, long trapped in silent complicity, were now paralyzed by the unrecognizable dynamics between the two central figures. Esther's hands shook uncontrollably as she cooked. Celia's eyes darted nervously. Marcus and Isaiah avoided any direct gaze, and young Penny barely breathed, as though the very act of exhaling might draw the attention of forces she could not see. Even Judith, the quiet linchpin of the household, whispered in hushed tones to herself, sensing that the moral fabric they had known had already torn. Thornhill's journal entries became increasingly frantic. The meticulous precision that had once defined him gave way to fevered scribbles, observations punctuated with exclamation points, the occasional Latin phrase, and diagrams of anatomy interlaced with occult symbols. He documented reactions, not just of the body, but of the mind, of fear itself, as though the psychology of his subjects could be mapped, measured, and manipulated with the same ease as heart rate or pulse. But his own mind was fracturing. Every success, every perceived breakthrough, came paired with terror, the realization that control was slipping, and that the essence he sought to command had developed its own will. The Society of Medical Inquiry, watching from afar, believed they had anticipated every variable. They had funded experiments, calculated risks, and invested in the promise of discovery. But even their cold, detached intellect could not account for the emergent consciousness in the room, the subtle awakening of autonomy, and the horrific brilliance of life refusing to be dominated. The descent into darkness was no longer theoretical. It had become tangible, a living, breathing force within the manor walls. And yet, the most profound revelations, the ones that would haunt every future generation, were still about to unfold. By the 7th week, Thornhill Manor had become a crucible of obsession and terror. The air itself seemed alive, thick with the tension of impending disaster. Virgilia, whose body had once betrayed her at every breath, now moved with sudden bursts of strength, her eyes burning with a clarity that terrified even the colonel. She was no longer merely a subject. She had become a presence, an agent in the experiment, subtly bending the conditions to her will. Every touch, every reaction between her and Silas shifted the balance, eroding Thornhill's authority in ways he had not foreseen and could not comprehend. Silas, whose stature had long made him appear subordinate, now radiated quiet dominance. His movements were precise, deliberate, almost ritualistic. With a single glance or gesture, he could control Virgilia's responses, manipulate the timing of the experiment, even unnerve the colonel himself. The experiment's intended mechanics, the transference of vitality, the controlled stimulation had taken on a life of their own, something uncontainable, almost sentient. Thornhill, who had believed mastery over life itself was within his grasp, now realized he had unleashed forces that refused to be contained, that would not bend entirely to human will. The household staff, trapped in the crossfire of forces far beyond their understanding, were witnesses to the collapse of hierarchical order. Esther's eyes, once resigned and obedient, now reflected horror. Celia's trembling hands betrayed the terror she could not name. Marcus and Isaiah avoided seeing what they could not alter. Penny, the youngest, sensed the invisible currents of power shifting in the room. Even Judith, who had managed the house with quiet authority, understood that what unfolded in the drawing room and basement had broken every law of human comprehension. Thornhill's mind, once the instrument of precision and control, was unraveling. His journal entries became fevered, incomprehensible, a tangle of anatomical diagrams, calculations, and occult symbols. Every observation, every formula, every attempt at dominance was met with the quiet defiance of two forces he had underestimated: Virgilia's intellect and Silas' subtle mastery. He realized too late that the essence he sought to control, life, vitality, human will, had its own agenda. And then, in the dead of night, it happened. The culmination of weeks of obsession, manipulation, and experimentation. The first irreversible transformation. Blood, energy, and something ineffable passed between Virgilia and Silas. The room vibrated with a tension so pure it seemed to warp reality itself. Thornhill watched, powerless, as the world he had attempted to command dissolved into a new order, one in which the hierarchy he had built was inverted, and the very knowledge he had pursued became his undoing. This was the moment when forbidden knowledge claimed its ultimate price, a lesson written not in books, not in journals, but in the lives, the power, and the terror that lingered long after the event itself. The dawn after the final night of the experiment brought a silence heavier than any storm. Thornhill Manor, once alive with the rhythms of wealth and power, now felt like a mausoleum. Virgilia, though physically altered, had emerged with a clarity and presence that defied comprehension. She moved with a quiet authority, a subtle dominion over the house and its occupants that none, not even Thornhill, could challenge. The transformation was more than physical. It was a command of essence itself, a consciousness sharpened and empowered by suffering, by manipulation, and by the forbidden alchemy of the experiment. Silas, the dwarf whose life had been purchased to serve as an instrument, now stood as equal, if not superior, in the hierarchy of influence. His calculated actions, the subtle gestures, the knowledge he wielded, had transformed him into something beyond the reach of colonial law or societal expectation. The experiment, meant to bend him and Virgilia to Thornhill's will, had instead inverted every assumption. He was no longer property. He was a pivot of power, a living testament to the danger of attempting to control life itself. Thornhill, once a man of absolute authority, found his mind unraveling under the weight of what he had unleashed. His journals, filled with fevered notes and diagrams, remained as the only testament to his intentions. Yet even these could not fully capture the subtleties, the emergent intelligence, and the profound moral rupture that had occurred within the house. The colonel had sought to master vitality, to manipulate life as a craftsman shapes clay, but he had instead become a witness to forces that defied comprehension, forces that would haunt every corner of the manor long after his death. The household staff, traumatized and forever changed, carried the story quietly through whispers and careful avoidance, their own understanding of morality, loyalty, and obedience forever fractured. The Society of Medical Inquiry, their investment in science and secrecy now yielding results beyond their prediction, recorded only cold observations in their vaults. They understood that the success of the experiment was irrelevant when measured against the human cost, and yet the knowledge was too dangerous, too volatile, to ever be destroyed. It was a secret meant to endure in shadows, a forbidden truth buried beneath layers of deception, speculation, and silence. Thornhill Manor remained, a monument to obsession, corruption, and the fragility of power. And the lesson it imparted is simple yet profound. When a man attempts to dominate life itself, he risks awakening forces far greater than his ambition, far more intelligent than his design, and far more enduring than his control. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some truths, once glimpsed, can never be forgotten. And some experiments, once begun, change the nature of everyone who witnesses them, forever. If you dare to see what the elite tried to hide, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Comment, "The spark has awakened," twice to prove you've entered the secret circle and witnessed the forbidden knowledge that changes everything.